I was going to make a little comment about, in the Ross book, there's a little story about a saloon that used to be in Ross called the Pink Saloon. It was where the Lagunitas Tennis Club is today. And after the earthquake, when more people were living here full time, they didn't like the idea of having this saloon that was changed to the tennis club. So our speaker today, Jeff Burkhardt, was born in Pennsylvania, the home of rye whiskey. Came to California, and he was here in the 60s and 70s for the music scene. And while in college, he worked in a number of restaurants, Large Creek Inn and Uncle Charlie's, and then he opened and operated the Fault Line nightclub. He went back to school and studied writing and has a degree in journalism, and recently published a book called 20 Years Behind Bars, The Spirited Adventures of a Real Bartender, which will be available today. I see he's only got 4 copies left, so I'm sure Jeff can tell you where more are available. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Burkhardt.
So thank you all for coming. My name is Jeff Burkhardt. I write the Barfly column, as you mentioned. So what I thought I'd do today is a little bit different. I'm going to expect you to use your imagination a little bit. So instead of just doing a straight reading from my book, I'm going to set it up in a little bit of a skit idea. So come with me to any bar, anywhere. Hi there. How are you? Can I get you something to drink? Okay. Sure. Have a seat. You know, we don't normally see a lot of black tie around here, but it's good to see that you've dressed up. So let me understand. You're an author, and you're writing a book, and your character's name is James Gibson, and you want to try a Gibson. All right. Well, let me make one for you. We're going to make a vodka Gibson, a bit of vodka, a little bit. More is always better. Stir it. No vermouth in a vodka Gibson, because you don't want your $20 vodka to taste like your $5 vermouth. Oh, you don't like onions. Well, if I don't put onions in it, it's not really a Gibson. But you know, I have a story about that. The Gibson guy. The man loomed over me like a supermodel in heels. His long angled face and closely cropped hair were a testament to face products and meticulous grooming. He was so model-like that he appeared almost plastic, too perfect, too put together, somehow not real. He leaned forward in his black zip-up turtleneck sweater and waved an arm circled by what looked like a chunky, Tiffany-style bracelet straight out of GQ magazine. "I'll have a Kettle One Gibson," he announced. There was a little tug on his sleeve, reminding him that he was on a date. He turned and inquired as to what his equally coiffed and manicured giant-sized supermodel date might want. Demurely, she nodded and without a sound agreed to his decision. She was clearly an afterthought, and from the look on her face, wasn't entirely pleased about it. But judging from how much time he had put into affecting his look, I got the impression that everyone else on the planet was probably an afterthought. "2 Gibsons," he boomed out, "with onions," he added as I turned to make them. Feeling somewhat cantankerous and being a bit of a pot stirrer, I ventured a question. "Sir, what else might I garnish the Gibson with?" "Well," said my chiseled friend, "most bartenders don't know how to make them." Most bartenders don't know how to make them? I have trained literally dozens of bartenders. I work with probably hundreds more. Of that small group, I would wager that none of them didn't know how to make a Gibson. Meaning that all of them did. You see, the Gibson cocktail is probably the second drink that bartenders learn how to make. The fact is, you really don't need to be taught what ingredients go into a rum and coke or a gin and tonic. They're pretty self-explanatory. The first real cocktail many bartenders learn how to make is the classic martini. Gin and dry vermouth garnished with an olive. Of course, if you work in a Mexican cantina, it's probably a margarita, but I'm trying to make a point here. Usually, the second cocktail learned, or taught, is the Gibson. Exactly the same as the classic martini, except garnished with an onion. In fact, it is just about the only classic cocktail that calls for a pickled cocktail onion. If you see onions in a tray at your local bar, they are there for the Gibson. As with many cocktails, the history of the Gibson is subject to various interpretations. The earliest known reference to the Gibson cocktail dates from a 1904 Piedmont dinner hotel menu that featured Gibson cocktails, ingredients not listed, as well as some other light fare. The usual story, and the one that seems to make the most sense, is that the Gibson was invented in honor of American iconic illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, famous for his stylized drawings that graced magazines across the country in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. He is probably best known for his creation of the Gibson girl, an idealized, aristocratic woman of fashionable yet domestic sensibilities that graced such magazines as Century, Harper's, Life, and Scribner's. His feminine ideal epitomized the anti-suffragette movement in the works at the time, the movement that eventually failed when women earned the right to vote in 1920. Some of Gibson's illustrations bore captions such as, "No time for politics," and "Not worried about her rights." He also illustrated many books, including classics such as Anthony Hope's Prisoner of Zenda and R.H. Davies' Soldiers of Fortune. The Gibson girl was thought to be patterned on Gibson's own demure wife, Irene Langhorne. However, the most famous Gibson girl was Danish-American actress Camille Clifford. Numerous illustrators copied Gibson's style, including Harry J. Peter, who is most famous for his drawings of the comic book heroine and prepubescent male fantasy, Wonder Woman. Gibson's girl was usually a tall, slender, youthful woman with an ample bosom and a cascading tumble of hair piled high on her head in a bouffant or pompadour fashion. Author Susan E. Meyer described her in the 1978 book, America's Great Illustrators, as appearing in a stiff shirtwaist, her soft hair piled in a chignon, topped by a big plumed hat. Her flowing skirt was hiked up in the back with just a hint of bustle. She was poised and patrician. Though always well-bred, there often lurked a flash of mischief in her eyes. This Gibson girl was the Barbie doll of her time, a beautiful, graceful, and completely non-threatening, man-friendly woman. The kind that needs a man to order her drink for her. In fact, Gibson eventually created a Gibson man to accompany her. The Gibson man was patterned on Gibson himself, or what he thought of himself. He was square-jawed and handsome, as well as clean-shaven, which was unusual at the time. This self-absorbed escort was perfect for the Gibson girl. A trend swept the nation as many people tried to pattern themselves after the two. After the end of World War I, women had earned the right to vote, if not to order for themselves, and the Gibson girl began to lose favor. Around this time, it is rumored that Gibson challenged bartender Charles Connolly of the Players Club in New York City to update his gin martini. Connolly is reported to have put an onion in Gibson's drink, called it a Gibson, and called it a day. With that much thought and effort put into inventing this cocktail, I'm led to believe that Gibson was not a very popular person at the Players Club. Today's Gibson is usually made with vodka, in keeping with the trend of martinis and their derivatives away from gin and towards vodka. It usually has a liberal splash of vermouth, unlike today's martini, and is garnished with cocktail onions. As I set down my Kendall's look-alike drinks, I had three thoughts. One, if you think your bartender might not know how to make a Gibson, go somewhere else where they employ trained bartenders. Two, if you choose to stay, you might be better served by saying, "I'll have a vodka martini with onions." That way you'll be sure to get what you want. And three, most importantly, ladies, if you have to ask your date to be considerate of you, no matter how handsome he is, you are fighting a losing battle. So, I agree, a martini with cocktail onions isn't all that sexy. What can we do? How about a daiquiri? You know, Hemingway used to drink daiquiris. No, not that daiquiri, not that one with strawberries and whipped cream and all that sort of thing, but a real man's daiquiri, which I'll show you. A little bit of fresh lime. A little bit of sugar. This is simple syrup, 50% water, 50% sugar. And a little bit of rum. Or a lot of rum. Shake it until it's cold. Strain it into a coupe. And there you have it, a Hemingway daiquiri. Although James Daiquiri is not a very good name for a hero, is it? What can we do? Well, I'm not sure what we can do, but it was nice to meet you. I hope you have a great night. Sorry we couldn't bond your hero's name to a cocktail. Good night. Shaken, not stirred, like that's ever going to catch on. So now the old man in the daiquiri. He sat at the busy bar, gingerly and awkwardly, trying desperately not to wrinkle his impeccably starched white shirt. He half-heartedly waved an expertly manicured hand as a crowd 3 deep swarmed like a living organism behind him. The fingernails on his dainty hands shone so brightly, my coworker remarked that they must never seen a day of hard or even remotely difficult work. Like so many people unaccustomed to busy bars, he had staked out a place far away from where the action was and was now attempting to make up for his lack of convenient placement by becoming increasingly anxious in his waving. Bar seating is different than restaurant seating. Just because you have secured a spot to sit doesn't necessarily guarantee the undivided attention of the bartender. Bartending is a commission-based business. The bigger the sale, the more money we make. Consequently, bartenders gravitate towards people who, shall we say, have demonstrated their generosity. Generally speaking, we size up the customer and determine the amount of time that we can devote to them. Of course, if it is not busy and time is plentiful, then everyone usually gets the same treatment. But when seconds count, the gal who just spent $200 on dinner is going to get the lion's share of the bartender's attention. If that means the guy drinking a glass of house white wine has to wait a little longer, well then so be it. Experience has taught me that running down to someone who positions themselves at the far end of the bar is not usually going to be fiscally rewarding, especially if there are 20 people waiting for service directly in front of me. No amount of waving your hand is going to change that. However, I finally did make my way down to our manicured man. "What can I bring for you?" I said. "I need your undivided attention," he said, "because I want something unusual." Great. It looked like I would have been better served staying at the other end of the bar. I put the drinks I was making down, made some change for someone else, picked up some dirty plates, and wiped up the crumbs at the bar, all the while trying to get Mr. Manicure to order. Finally, he realized that some attention was all he was going to get, and then went ahead and ordered. "I want a measure of rum," he said, holding up 2 fingers, spaced about an inch apart, as if indicating the size of a measure. "Squeeze some fresh lime juice, add a teaspoon of sugar, shake it until ice crystals form, strain it, and serve it in a martini glass," he said, as if it were Einstein's theory of relativity he was explaining. "And like Einstein's theory, this drink too already exists." "You mean you want a daiquiri?" He looked at me dumbfounded. "No, I want a measure of rum." He started again. "That's called a daiquiri," I said. "I thought daiquiris had strawberries in them." "No, the true daiquiri is named after either the town or the river of the same name in Cuba. Like many drink names, no one knows for sure. We do know that the original was made popular by man's man Ernest Hemingway. Reportedly, he would hang out at the Cuban restaurant named La Floridita, which, according to author Norberto Fuentes, was Hemingway's favorite place. In his book Hemingway in Cuba, he writes, there the daiquiri cocktail was created, which Hemingway helped to make known throughout the world. But as he was to write later, his main interest in the place was not so much his food and drink, but his desire to meet the tempestuous current of his countrymen who passed through the city. Soon after, the restaurant became a haven for Cuba's visiting celebrities living in or passing through Havana. The list of daiquiri drinkers came to include several of Hollywood's greatest names. People like Errol Flynn, Ava Gardner, Gary Cooper, and John Wayne enjoyed one or several of the tart tropical quotations, leading possibly to some pounding morning headaches and a few wishes for a quick death in the afternoon. Eventually, Castro put an end to Hemingway's Cuba. Americans responded by sissifying the cocktail, adding blended strawberries and whipped cream, which, after removing the alcohol, is known to 12-year-olds everywhere as the Virgin Daiquiri. I placed the man's cocktail down in front of my manicured friend. I was just beginning to think I'd read him wrong, that in spite of his pristine personal grooming, he might be, "Can I get it with a sugar grin?" he added, interrupting my thought. "Of course you can," I said, reassured that my powers of observation were intact. As I set the drink down for a second time, I couldn't help wondering if Hemingway ever had his nails done. So on the note of James Bond, I'm going to make the best Christmas cocktail. What I'm going to use is some Chardonnay vodka, which is a local product made in Ukai. I'm going to use a little of Quina Labion, which is also, it's imported by a local company in Petaluma called Tempest Phuket, and some 209 gin, which is made in San Francisco by a good friend of mine, Arne Hildebrand. This actually is a kosher product. The difference is that the Vesper is often called for Lillet, which I'll explain in a little bit, but Quina Labion is more similar to what the original product was. And again, I'll explain that in just a short period here. Nice and tight. Strain it into a cocktail glass, and that's James Bond's martini, which I have a story about. Karl Marx once said that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. He was referring to Napoleon III of France. However, this quote has occurred to me several times over the last couple of months. Do you know how to make the new drink, the Vesper? Asked the bifocal-wearing man in his late 50s sitting at the bar. I had to look twice, because I hadn't seen actual bifocals since journalism school. New as in 1953 new? I asked. What do you mean? He asked. That drink has been around more or less since Ian Fleming wrote Casino Royale, the very first James Bond book, I said. He looked at me through the upper part of his bifocals. Not knowing what to say, he stuck out his hand, which clutched a rather crumply piece of paper. Before I looked at the paper, I had already guessed as to where this was heading. It doesn't happen often, but occasionally bar patrons will actually print up instructions on how to make their drinks. Sometimes they even bring their own glassware, and occasionally their own garnishes. Invariably, these printed recipes are not quite accurate. I might add that their glassware isn't very durable, and I bet their garnishes aren't very tasty, but I digress. Once I was handed the recipe for a Bloody Mary that listed at least 6 different ingredients. It included 3 steps for assembling the ingredients and specifications for the size and type of glass. The only thing not listed on the condescending instructions was tomato juice. I made the drink as instructed, only to have it appear in one hand of a tall, disgruntled customer standing at the bar. The other hand held the instructions. "Where's the tomato juice?" he demanded. "Your instructions didn't ask for it." He looked at his instructions, and then he looked at me, and then he looked at his instructions again. "I figured you would know that it needed tomato juice," he said. And I figured that if someone took the time and money to print up cards with his preferred recipe on them, that recipe would be complete. Silly me. I scanned the ingredients for this new Vesper on the crumply paper. 2 ounces of Gordon's gin, 1 ounce of vodka. Close enough, I thought. And when I got to the splash of Quina Lillet, I smiled. They no longer make Quina Lillet. But there it was, printed on the recipe card. It wasn't really the bifocal man's fault. It was Ian Fleming's fault. You see, they weren't even making Quina Lillet when he first wrote those instructions for the very first book, way back in 1953. Casino Royale has now been adapted for the screen 3 separate times. First as a 1954 CBS television episode, secondly as a 1967 big screen spoof starring David Niven as 007, farce first, tragedy, and then tragedy, take that marks. And the 2006 version starring Daniel Craig as Bond. Important to note, Quina Lillet was unavailable for all of them. Quina Lillet was created in the late 1800s in France, an aromatized aperitif wine, similar to vermouth. It gains its primary flavoring from quinine, whose bitter taste most people are familiar with from tonic water. Extracted from the bark of the South American cinchona tree, known as the quina quina tree, these tonics came to be known as quina quinas. Today, quinine is best known for its use in the unsuccessful treatment of malaria, as well as its mixing with gin in the classic gin and tonic. Called the aperitif of Bordeaux, Quina Lillet featured white wine from the Guion region in southwestern France, a region that roughly covers the same area as the legendary Bordeaux region. Fruit, liqueur, and some quinine. In the 1920s, a second brand called Lillet Dry was created for the British market, which was designed to be mixed with gin, a la Big Martini. The company reduced the amount of quinine and began reducing the prominence of quina in the name. Around 1930, quina seems to have disappeared from the name altogether. Fleming's book notwithstanding. By 1960, the company began producing Lillet Rouge, at which point Lillet Dry became Lillet Blanc, or Blanc. Both varieties are now produced in the French town of Podenzac. Not finished tinkering, in 1985, the company again reduced the quinine content in the Lillet Blanc, rendering the new product almost completely different from the original. Part of the overall confusion might be that Fleming himself only lived part-time in Jamaica, where even to this day, some liquors can be hard to find and others hang around indefinitely. Combined with the fact that, according to biographer Andrew Lycett, Fleming himself really didn't hold his drinks very well. More than 2 glasses of wine at lunchtime, and he was done for. Which, compared to James Bond, who in the novel Casino Royale drinks 13 drinks, as well as 4 bottles of champagne, and smokes 3.5 packs of cigarettes, Fleming was a real lifer. As a side note, it is also highly doubtful that anyone treating their body so disdainfully would have the physique of Daniel Craig. Now, a current Roger Moore? Perhaps. As I set down Mr. Bifocal's drinks, I thought of all these things. I also recalled that Gordon's gin, called for the original recipe, also changed their formulation, reducing the original proof of their gin from 90 to 86 in 1974. As I handed him back his crumbly instructions, I smiled inwardly. Just like James Bond, I said. That's right, he answered. Well, perhaps not. The drink I had just prepared bore little, if any, resemblance to Bond Fleming's original creation, if in fact it ever existed, proving that perhaps Mr. Marx was right after all. So thank you all very much for coming. I have a couple more books that are available, and I'll be happy to sign them for you. And in the spirit of all things Barfly, I would like to leave you with 3 thoughts. 1, it wasn't the vodka martini that made James Bond. James Bond made the vodka martini. 2, Bond's very first cocktail was named after his girlfriend, Bess Berlin. And 3, when going out to bars, please remember this. I know that I am not James Bond. It's important to remember that neither are you. I'd like to make that first record.